In this lecture, we're going to continue discussing the ABCs of behavior analysis, specifically how do we assess preference. To do this, we need to establish what are the preferred items for clients or those individuals whose behavior that we care about. So why should we care what clients' preferred items are? Well, the main reason is these preferred items can potentially be used as reinforcers in an intervention where we try to encourage and increase the appropriate behaviors that we want in the individual. Additionally, assessing for preference allows clients to make choices and can enhance their quality of life. There are some things to consider about preference, though. For example, if a client prefers an item on Tuesday, will he or she prefer them on Wednesday, or 1 month from now, 6 months from now, etc.? So we have to consider deprivation and satiation levels, which we'll get to a little bit more in depth in a moment. The most important thing is just to bear in mind that preferences change over time. What you like in the morning is not necessarily what you want in the evening for a meal, for example. Or what you're really into at the age of 15 is probably not the same things you're into at the age of 30. Before we discuss how to determine what preferred items are, let's talk about reinforcer effectiveness. There are several factors that will influence the effectiveness of reinforcement. The first, as we just mentioned, is deprivation or motivation. Deprivation means that a stimulus or an item or something of interest to the individual has not been in their possession. They have been deprived of it or not had access to it. To use a stimulus as a reinforcer, it will only be effective if the individual does not have free access to it beforehand, that is, if they are deprived. Only then will they be motivated to work for this item or event. The second factor is the immediacy of reinforcement. In general, the more immediately we give a reinforcer after the behavior has occurred, the greater the probability of increasing responding. The more delayed the reinforcement is from the time the behavior occurs until we deliver it, the less probability of increased responding will occur. We know in general that reinforcers should be delivered within 60 seconds after the behavior has occurred. But can a behavior be reinforced days, weeks, or years later? In general, when we're talking about operant conditioning, we don't use delayed reinforcers. However, we do know that in humans, there are cases where delayed reinforcement can be effective at maintaining behavior. For example, think about a grade in a class or a paycheck for work. Our third factor is the size or magnitude of the reinforcer. This is how much of the reinforcer is delivered to the individual. So for example, if I want you to run 8 laps around the gym and I offer you 1 M&M, that might not be a sizable enough reinforcer to get you to do it. But if I offer you a bag of M&Ms, that might be reinforcing enough for at least some of you to go ahead and engage in that behavior. The final factor is contingency. And what we mean here is that the reinforcer should be delivered only based on the appropriate behavior being exhibited. This kind of relates back to our deprivation. If they have access to the reinforcer or potential reinforcer at other times, or it's delivered at other times, then there's no reason they have to engage in the appropriate behavior because they can find other ways to get it. So again, we know what reinforcement is. It's the delivery of a consequence which increases the future probability of a behavior occurring. However, reinforcement also makes our antecedent events relevant. So remember, reinforcement takes place as a consequence in our 3-term contingency, which means it takes place after the behavior. However, what it does do is indicate that that antecedent, when it occurs, will be followed by a reinforcer if the appropriate behavior is engaged in. So for example, if you see a sign that says free food, which is an antecedent, that only becomes relevant after you follow such signs in the past, and that ends with the delivery of food or reinforcement. Also, it's important to bear in mind that reinforcement depends on motivation. So again, seeing a sign for free food, when previously seeing signs for free food has led us to get food when we go towards where they are, will only work if we're actually hungry for that food, if we've been deprived of the food. If you're satiated on something, for example, if you just ate a large meal, then food may not work as a strong reinforcer. However, if you're hungry, again, if you're deprived of food, food may evoke more behavior in the presence of signs that indicate food is available. So when we talk about motivating operations, again, it's an object or event that alters the effectiveness of some object or event to function as a reinforcer. So what that really means is motivating operations are going to occur in our antecedent. So in the example here of an antecedent where somebody says, do this, and then claps their hands, the individual of interest engages in clapping, and then they're delivered food. It will only be effective if there's been food deprivation. So if they're hungry, then that food will probably function as a reinforcer. So having not eaten in a while or being deprived of food increases the effectiveness of food as a reinforcer. That is a type of motivating operation known as an establishing operation. This means that the motivating operation in place increases the potency or effectiveness of a consequence. On the other hand, we can also have abolishing operations, which decrease the potency or effectiveness of a consequence. For example, as we just mentioned, if the individual we are trying to get to clap had just eaten a large meal, then food might not be very effective as a reinforcer. So again, remember, motivating operations occur before the antecedent behavior and consequence part. In the presence of a motivating operation, a state of deprivation or satiation, then a discriminative stimulus or antecedent condition is presented, which is followed by a behavior, which is followed by a consequence. So again, the SD indicates that in the presence of the behavior, then some consequence will occur. If that consequence occurs repeatedly over time, then that means that we'll be more likely to engage in that behavior when the SD happens. In addition, those consequences also increase the strength of the discriminative stimulus, the power it has to evoke the behavior of interest. So again, the more times you are exposed to the discriminative stimulus and it's followed by a consequence contingent on behavior, the more likely in the future when you see that discriminative stimulus you are to engage in the behavior. And then finally, the motivating operation increases the effectiveness of the consequence. So the big thing to remember here, because motivating operations and discriminative stimuli or S deltas can become confusing, is that motivating operations alter the effectiveness of the consequence, whereas discriminative stimuli indicate whether or not a consequence is available. When we talk about the types of reinforcers that are available to us, we can categorize them by the source of the reinforcer and the physical type of the reinforcer. So when we talk about the source of a reinforcer, we're talking about how it is presented to the individual. And these can be broken down into automatic reinforcement, which is a direct result of the behavior. For example, if you were to scratch an itch. Automatic reinforcers generally end up being reinforcing because they feel good in some way. They either alleviate some condition that you do not want, or they add a condition that you do. Alternatively, there's also social reinforcement, which is the result of somebody else's behavior. The important distinction here is that social reinforcers are often easier to take control of because they require another person in order to present them. However, automatic reinforcers are not as easily controlled because we cannot access the actual reinforcer itself. Only the individual engaging in that behavior can. When we start categorizing reinforcers by physical types, we can break them down into sensory types, usually involving sound or light or some sort of proprioception, and these generally result in some kind of sensory stimulation to the individual, which may function as a reinforcing consequence. We can also have attention-based reinforcers. A lot of times these include verbal praise, acknowledgement, close proximity to someone else, and a variety of other things such as high fives or head scratches, where somebody else gives attention to the individual of interest, which may be reinforcing. There are also edible reinforcers, which are anything that we can eat or drink. Tangible reinforcers, which are items such as toys or money. Whenever you think of a tangible reinforcer, think of something that you can hold. And then finally, activity reinforcers, which is access to an area or event. So for example, allowing a child to go to recess if they complete their work would be access to recess and an activity. We've talked a little bit before about conditioned versus unconditioned reinforcers. So reinforcing functions can be the result of the physical properties of the stimulus or the behavioral history with which the organism has had with that stimulus. What that means is we basically have two types: unconditioned reinforcers, which are items that are reinforcing relevant to the context that do not require a learning history to function as reinforcers. These are things that all humans like pretty much from birth. So things like food, sex, drugs, etc., all don't require a learning history in order to have reinforcing consequences. These are also called primary reinforcers. Additionally, we have conditioned reinforcers, which are stimuli that are reinforcing due to a learning history, that have come to function as reinforcers. For example, praise before you learn what language is really doesn't have much of an effect on behavior. But once praise is paired with other things over time, then it becomes a conditioned reinforcer, and we don't need to use things like food or drink or something along those lines that are unconditioned reinforcers. These are often called secondary reinforcers. So why should we care about conditioned reinforcers? Well, again, we know reinforcement is more likely to occur when there's no delay between the behavior itself and the presentation of a reinforcer. Conditioned reinforcers are often words or small items that can be delivered quickly and immediately and can be carried with you whenever you have to move somewhere else for your instructional time. It may take many applications of reinforcement to achieve our goal as well, so we want to make sure we're using as many different types of reinforcers as possible. Conditioned reinforcers are often free, cheap, or represent only portions of a total reinforcer. Again, we want to avoid satiation if we want our reinforcers to be effective. Edibles and other primary reinforcers can often cause satiation or a period of disinterest from the individual themselves. And finally, we can begin to use generalized conditioned reinforcement. These do not require a motivating operation to work necessarily. They are reinforcers that have been paired with many different unconditioned reinforcers and conditioned reinforcers. Probably the best example of this, at least in our country, is money. Money is a generalized conditioned reinforcer because you can use money to access a lot of other reinforcing items. And after enough pairings, you start to like money even if you don't necessarily need money in the moment. So what types of reinforcers can we condition? Well, the first step is we need to identify the source of reinforcement. Is it positive or negative reinforcement? Is it social or automatic reinforcement? What is the type of reinforcer? And is it already a conditioned reinforcer or not? As far as what can be conditioned, just about anything can be conditioned as a reinforcer. So things like hugs, money, stickers, time watching TV, getting out of a chore card, completing a puzzle, or even walking outside on a sunny day are all conditioned reinforcers. So how do we figure out what reinforcers will work for an individual? The methods to identify potential reinforcers vary across the literature, but all involve some assessment of preference in our individual of interest. Reinforcement effects are idiosyncratic to the individual. What this means is that what's reinforcing for one person's behavior is not reinforcing for all people. For example, my friend may like a show on TV such as Teen Mom. Thus, being allowed to watch Teen Mom contingent on a behavior like doing the dishes might result in that behavior increasing for my friend. However, I do not like that show, so it would not be reinforcing to my behavior. So when we need to figure out what people's preferences are, it gets a little bit tricky when we're working with individuals with disabilities. Potential reinforcers are often identified for people by asking them what they like, but if the individual has limited verbal abilities, this may hinder this procedure. If you can, asking an individual is generally a pretty good correspondence between the verbal description that they give you and observed performances. That is, what people say they like tends to be what they actually like. However, if they don't have this ability, then we have to come up with more clever ways to be able to discover what types of items that individuals prefer, which may function as a reinforcer. The search for reinforcers then generally begins with what is known as a preference assessment. So here we want to figure out what types of things does the person like the most. And again, remember, these are preferred items. And we'll talk about the difference between establishing if it's a reinforcer or not at the end of this lecture. So again, preference is a term used to describe the probability of somebody engaging with a particular stimulus or item. Preference assessments can be indirect, meaning based on the behaviors of others. So these are things like interviews with either the individual themselves or interviews with the parent or somebody who's familiar with that individual. So again, you could ask many different people, including teachers, peers, siblings, etc. Alternatively, they can also be direct, which means they're based on direct observation of the individual when we give them access to items, and we see which items they choose the most. For indirect preference assessments, again, we typically are going to have some sort of interview, which can have a structured sheet, like this is an example of something called a raised interview. And so here you would just simply ask these questions of the individuals who you're interviewing. So you'd say, please answer the following questions regarding whoever the individual of interest is. And then you would say, some children really enjoy looking at things such as mirrors, bright lights, shiny objects, spinning objects, etc. What are the things that you think the individual most likes to watch? And you can start to get a list of things that may be preferred items. However, for the most part in behavior analysis, we do tend to use direct preference assessments. There are several different types, ranging from least to most complicated. The first one is known as a free operant preference assessment. Here, items are placed in an environment, and the individual is allowed to access any item at any time for a certain period of time. Preference here, then, is usually determined by comparing the duration with which the individual engages with particular stimuli. So if we have a toy truck and a toy puzzle and maybe another person in the room, and they frequently go to the truck, they spend maybe 8 out of the 10 minutes playing with the truck, we can assume the truck is probably the most preferred item. These can also be natural or contrived, so it may just be all of the items that are naturally in a room, such as in a classroom, or we may contrive it where we bring in items that we think they might actually have a preference for. In addition, we can run what's called a single stimulus preference assessment, or the PACE method. Here we provide items to the individual one at a time, and then we determine preference by looking at how long it takes the individual to interact with the item and how long they actually interact with the item once they start to. So again, with the approach or avoid stimulus or single stimulus preference assessment, items are presented one at a time in front of the participant, and their response is recorded. We also record whether or not they manipulate the item, what their affect looks like, so are they smiling while they're interacting with it, do they reach for objects, and all of these things indicate that they're probably preferred if they're actually approaching the item. So a data sheet for this might look something like this. Did they manipulate the item for at least 15 seconds? Did they resist interacting with it? Do they reach shortly after you present the item? Do they have a positive affect? Do they look away when you put the item down? Do they attempt to change the subject or engage in self-stimulatory behavior, or do they stop doing what they're doing altogether? While the single stimulus method can be effective at figuring out what items are preferred, it doesn't give us a hierarchy of preferred items. So we don't know what's the most preferred or least preferred. We only know what things the individual will interact with. Some individuals might approach all of the items just out of curiosity. Some might approach none of the items. A second type of direct preference assessment is known as the paired stimulus preference assessment or forced choice preference assessment. Here, the individual is presented with a forced choice between two items. Item presentations are balanced so that each item is paired with each other item at least one time throughout the method. Preference is determined by comparing the number of times an item is selected by the number of times it is presented. So that is, on each individual trial, the item has a decision between one of two items, and the one they choose the most often is likely the most preferred. The purpose of the forced choice or paired stimulus preference assessment is that it replicates what is frequently used in basic operant research, where a concurrent operants paradigm is used. What this means is that two available options are presented, and whatever the choice that the individual or subject makes is recorded. And we can use these same methods to see which items an individual prefers more or less than all other available items. So again, it's a very simple procedure whereby the individual is presented with potentially preferred items in pairs, 2 at a time, and their client selection is recorded. Then the most preferred item is generally going to be seen as the one selected the first in most of the pairings. This gives us a little bit of a more quick method in order to ascertain preference than using the single item method or single stimulus method. A final form of direct preference assessment is called the multiple stimulus with replacement or the multiple stimulus without replacement preference assessment. Here, rather than presenting only pairs of items at a time, a selection of items are presented to the individual. For example, 10 foods on a plate or 5 different objects that they might be able to manipulate. In the multiple stimulus with replacement preference assessment, once the individual selects something, they're allowed to engage in it. So if they select an edible, they're allowed to eat it, and if they select a toy, they get about 30 seconds to play with it. In the with replacement preference assessment, the item is then placed back into the array, and the individual is given another choice to try from all of the available items. In without replacement, whatever the individual picks is removed. So if it's a food, then no more food is presented, and if it's a toy, then that toy is removed from the group of items that the individual can pick from on the next trial. Preference is then determined by the number of times a food is selected compared to the number of times it is presented, or that a toy or other tangible item is selected. Again, the method here, and the most common form of this, is the without replacement method. So you select 6 to 8 items that are thought to be potential reinforcers or preferred items, and you put all of the items out and allow the person to select one of them. You allow them to consume food items or interact with an activity or a tangible item for about 5 to 10 seconds, and then you remove that item and start over again with the remaining items. You repeat this until all items have been chosen. Once you see at which point each of the items is chosen, then you can average out approximately at what number the item was selected. So for example, on this data sheet, you can see candy was selected on average about the first to second trial, at trial 1.5. So it is likely the most preferred item. So knowing that we have all of these preference assessments to select from, how do we know which one to use? Well, with indirect methods, we almost always want to conduct them in conjunction with direct observation. So in addition to asking about what items individuals prefer, we still want to do a direct assessment as well. However, with highly verbal individuals, sometimes we don't need the direct observation because they're able to report their wants and desires. Free operant assessments are valuable when you do not want to interfere with the ongoing setting. So again, for example, in applied settings such as a school classroom, free operant assessments make the most sense because you don't need to control the environment as much. However, the individual must be capable of independently engaging with the items that you present. Free operant assessments are also not likely to yield many results when the individual engages in a restricted repertoire of behavior. That is, if they have significant skill deficits or if they engage in repetitive motions such as stereotypy. The single stimulus preference assessment is the most rigorous procedure, and it requires a great deal of time and technical skill to complete. The MSWO, or multiple stimulus without replacement, is used when individuals can make choices from among a large array of possible things. It is faster and more simple than the paired choice procedure, and is probably the most widely used in behavior analysis. It can also easily be implemented by teachers and parents. So when we're starting to think about which preference assessment to use, we have to look at what's the best way to train staff to do a preference assessment, Who's going to be implementing it? Will a teacher be able to run an MSWO, or do we maybe need to run a pre-operand? If an item is preferred, then we also need to figure out, does that mean it's a reinforcer for the client? We know the definition of a reinforcer is a consequence that's provided following a behavior which increases the future probability of that behavior. So by definition, in order for something to function as a behavior, to function as a reinforcer, we have to establish that it increases behavior that it follows. So again, remember, preference is not necessarily reinforcement. A preference for an item doesn't make it a reinforcer. Again, depending on the size of it, how available it is to you in your environment, just because you like something doesn't mean you're willing to work for it. A reinforcer then is defined by the functional relationship to a particular behavior. Does it increase future rates of behavior? A preference, on the other hand, is defined by the probability of an individual engaging with an item or edible or some sort of event. So consider the following. Many of us like some form of food. A lot of us like sweets such as cake. So think of a food that you like and think to yourself, would it serve as a reinforcer for working at JCPenney for a month? A single cake is probably not going to motivate you to go to work every day. For example, I like money and I prefer to receive it whenever possible, but is it reinforcing when provided in exchange for some sort of immoral behavior that I'm opposed to? Probably not. So to determine whether or not our preferred item is a reinforcer, we conduct what's called a reinforcement assessment, or reinforcer assessment. After determining the preferred item, the reinforcer assessment involves providing the highly preferred item contingent on a specific or simple behavior. In much of the literature, these will be simple tasks like shape sorters, where you have a plastic cube with holes in it of various shapes, and each shape fits in a very specific slot. And you teach the person to engage in the behavior, and after providing the preferred item, if they engage in the behavior more readily or more quickly, then we can say the item is said to function as a reinforcer for that behavior. For example, if cake is determined to be highly preferred and veggies is non-preferred, if I provide cake to somebody after they raise their hand and their hand raising behavior increases, then we know that cake is likely a reinforcer and veggies are likely not.